Okay. Okay. Good morning, everyone. We are today into this talk. I'm very happy to present this talk, and this meeting is going to be part of the EU LIFE project within the LIFE program of the European Union. LIFE aims to contribute to achieving the goals of the European Green Pact, in particular those of the Farm to Fork strategy. Those goals are to reduce the carbon footprint of food, to ensure food security and access to food everyone, and in sum, to ensure healthy, sustainable, and fairer food systems. So this is a talk sponsored by Fundesplai in collaboration with FORK, the Food Design Organization, and we welcome today to Fabio Parasecoli and Sonia Massari that will share with us their knowledge. So thank you very much for being with us today. And I will give the stage to Fabio before, then to Sonia, and then we will have some questions and answers. So thank you very much for being here.
Thank you for the invitation. So I will go first, and this morning we'll be talking about food systems, and I've prepared a few slides to help us in our chat. Let me share. There we go. All right, I will like to start from a couple of examples that we are all very familiar with to understand what food systems are and how we can understand them. So you all know that in February 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. And the war is still going on, now getting into winter. There are many aspects to the war, the impact the war that has had on international politics, on arms dealing, but on energy, very important for those who live in Europe. They know that now gas and oil are very expensive. But this morning, I would just like to ask you to focus on one aspect, the impact of a war on the wheat production of both Ukraine and Russia. Because of the war, many farmers, for instance, in Ukraine, had to leave their fields. Now there are mines in the field. It's unclear how much wheat will be produced in the future. Russia has only recently allowed wheat to come out of Odessa, out of the ports of Ukraine. And at the same time, Russia is isolated by an embargo. And so not much wheat can leave Russia. It so happened, though, that Russia and Ukraine together are among the biggest exporters of wheat in the world. So an event that would seem focused on one specific part of Eastern Europe, in reality, has got consequences and impacts all over the world. So, for instance, there are some countries that depend heavily on imports of wheat from Russia and Ukraine. And so we've had, as you can see in this case in Lebanon, demonstration of people who now cannot afford their bread because the price of wheat is gone through the roof. It's become very, very high all around the world. And Lebanon is just an example. There are many countries in the Middle East and in Africa that really depend heavily on Ukrainian wheat. And so that is creating also destabilization, political destabilization inside those countries. Many of the, let's say, networks of trade, of distribution of food have suffered because of this. So, for instance, here we see an example from Eastern Europe. Some more traditional food productions have come back because, the large industrial trade is suffering. So here we see one lady that clearly makes cheese and cream at home, selling her products on the street. So this is coming back. For instance, in Eastern Europe, you see more and more of this, anywhere from Poland to Moldova, which is in a way showing how resilient these traditional ways of food production are, so that they can somehow make up for the lack of international trade. Another problem that we might not think of is that much of international food aid is wheat. But what happens when wheat is not available? Suddenly the cost of this international aid increases, which means that there will be less available for people around the world. And at the same time, pressures on the cost of other grains like rice or corn are becoming visible. Second example, you remember COVID, right? It was not so long ago. One of the consequences of COVID is that basically supply chains faltered for many reasons, because people were sick and they could not work in production or distribution, because there were bottlenecks in transportation. Basically, the event of COVID showed how fragile these supply chains are. And so at the moment, there was a lot of thinking, well, maybe this is the time where we can rethink how food is produced, distributed, consumed in the world. Maybe this can be a lesson for the future. In reality, not much has happened. So I think these two examples help us understand how interconnected food production is around the world. And so to a certain extent, we can talk about a global food system. A global food system that it's also sort of made or of more localized food systems. And by food systems, I mean a whole meshwork, and I use the word meshwork to indicate how complex this is. It's not just a network, it's a meshwork of stakeholders. People have a stake in food production, consumption, distribution. And these stakeholders actually are not only human. Most of the time we think of, food companies or food producers or consumers, but it's much more complicated than that. For instance, we have to think about non-human stakeholders in the food system, starting from, the soil and the microbes living in the soil, the microbes and the bacteria living in our guts, our biome, plants, animals. That makes us understand how closely connected is the food system with ecological systems around the world. But food systems is also made of things, because of course then, plants, animal, the work of producers create things that are exchanged, transported, consumed. But to do this, we also have to take into consideration infrastructures and logistics. So those also become very important aspects of food systems. And the examples we just discussed about Ukraine and COVID shows how important logistics, the organization of the food systems, and the infrastructures that support these organizations are central. And by that, we can talk of anything from boats and trains to the software systems that coordinate, the distribution of food, of grain from Ukraine to Lebanon. So there's also this aspect of technology that has become quite important in the food systems. Now, wheat is traded on the stock market, and that can happen because of communication systems that are quick and that allow, I don't know, an investor in Japan to buy wheat on the Chicago market in 1 second. That also brings us to another element in food systems, which is governance. How is the food system organized? How is the power distribution? What sort of regulations support the functioning of the food system? And because of this, we cannot forget that one important part of food systems are also foodways, which is the way people think, talk, use food. So it's, let's say, the more cultural, social aspect of food, but they have huge impacts. The fact that in Lebanon, because of tradition, bread has such an important central role explains why a crisis in Ukraine becomes so important. So you can see that the cultural and social aspects, the foodways, are very much connected with the structural aspects of food systems. And so we can think of food systems as local, regional, national, but also global. Now, I want you to look at these two images for 1 second. How do we conceptualize food systems? As designers, you know very well that it's very important to have models of what we're dealing with to then decide how to intervene. So we can think of the food system as something that you see on the left, which is very neat. Every piece fits well in the rest. So you have farming connected with the biological system and the economic systems that connects with demand, that it's influenced by the political system. This way of thinking is useful when we need to analyze. Somehow we have to make order in our head. But I believe, and most people working in food systems also agree, that the reality of food systems is what you see on the right. A meshwork where nodes are interconnected in many complex ways. The players can relate to each other in different ways. So while the reality of the food systems is what we see on the right, that messy meshwork, sometimes we need to use the concepts to make clear, for instance, supply chains. You know, supply chains, of course, do not exist in reality as we think of them. Supply chains are an analytical tool that then we use to manage the supply chains. We have to make clear ideas in our head to intervene. But I think as designers, you need, because I'm not one, but you need to keep in mind this complexity, the fact it's a meshwork. In reality, the food system is one of the wicked problems that urban designers started thinking about in the early 70s. What does it mean? What is a wicked problem? It's a problem that, first of all, cannot be defined clearly. As we said, the food system is a meshwork. It's shifting. It changes all the time. The role of the stakeholders must change. The food system, like wicked problems, is multiscalar. As we said, you can think of it at the local level and at the global level. And it's interconnected. So because of this, there are many stakeholders with conflicting agendas. And this is very important. For me, it's one of the important elements we don't think so much about. The producer of artisanal cheese and the industrial producer of cheese and the consumer of cheese and the regulators at the national or at the international level all have different agendas. And so what the food system is also the result of these negotiations, power and political negotiations among the stakeholders. Now, this thinking of the food system in wicked problems, for instance, can help us think about very important issues. For instance, who has access to good food? First of all, what is good food, where it comes from, but who has access? Not everybody has the same access to good food for economic reasons, for cultural reasons, for geographical reasons. Even within the same city, in certain areas, you find much more fresh, good food than in other areas. So the other connected system is who can afford good food. So here we see a picture of a farmer's market in the US where everything is fresh, it's tasty, but it's also more expensive. So thinking about this in terms of food systems, we have to ask ourselves, why is this food at the farmer's market more expensive? Where does it come from? Who is involved? Who can afford to buy there? And why can these people afford to buy there where other people cannot and have to buy at a supermarket? That also, I think, leads us to a very important point, and I'm almost done. I still have 4 minutes, I see. Because of the complexity of this meshwork, we cannot just think of interventions in terms of personal decisions. Because of the sort of neoliberal mentality now, we think that the market is the key for everything. So behavior in the market can impact the market. So bringing it down to us, our decisions, what we decide to buy or not to buy or to boycott, can have impacts on the food systems. To a certain extent, that's true. If all the consumers stop buying one product because they think it's bad, clearly that company will go into trouble. But sometimes there are issues because of the complexity of the food systems that cannot be solved just by our individual decisions. They need political interventions. So, for instance, let's look at the issue of GMO. Very often the thought is, well, if consumers stop buying GMOs, then company will stop producing it. I think it's more complicated than that because there are structural elements underneath, political power issues, but also intellectual property issues. What is more important, the health impact of GMOs, of which we're not sure yet, or the fact that intellectual property is owned by a few companies on Earth that impose licenses on farmers so that they have to pay every time they use them? I think the impact on the food system is much more important and durable from the intellectual property point of view. But intellectual property laws, especially global ones, can only be changed by political interventions, by voting, by pushing on political representatives, because these are decisions that are made by governments. Let's think about food waste. We can work on our personal food waste, and that's very important so that we make sure that what's in our fridge doesn't go bad. But food waste is an issue that affects all aspects of the food system, to the point that we can talk about food loss on the fields. How much is not gathered? How much gets spoiled? How much is not conserved properly? So I would stop here with this last thought. There are issues in which our individual positions and decisions can have a direct impact, but there are others that, because of the complexity of the food system as a meshwork, require larger political interventions. And I stayed within 20 minutes.
Great. Thank you very much, Fabio. Thank you very much. So we will give the stage to Sonia. Hi, Sonia, if you can turn on your camera.
Oh, here we go.
I hope so. I was already worried that it didn't work, but it works.
Yeah, it works. It works. Give me 1 second.
Me too. Okay.
Okay.
You know what, I can start.
Well, yeah. It is working. The stage is yours, Sonia.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for this invitation, and thank you, Fabio, for this wonderful introduction that brings you definitely inside of the topic of the systems and how we can actually consider food as a complex system, which is a very key point. My role today will be to go through the role of the design in this complexity. So I'm going to share my screen as well. If everything will works well, and let's see, just give me a feedback that you see my presentation. Okay, perfect. I decided to call and giving this title to my presentation, Food Systems and Design, Being Sustainable Natives in a Digital World. And we will talk about what does it mean to be sustainable natives and designing a world for sustainable natives. But first, let me just give you an explanation on the fact that designer many time works in different fields. I just start from me on the fact that we are able nowadays to work with the organization that wants to get advocacy, so practically to teach other people what is the role of the design and how design can be used as a participatory approach to change, let's say, the approach to the food system. On the other side, it's also good to know that designers are starting working with scientists, researchers, and people at the beginning of the food supply chain. So in a way, we are not just be considered at the end when we talk about consumption, but instead the way how we redesign, rethink the food system start to become quite interesting also when we talk about production and definitely how we redesign the entire food system. So I'm starting with a kind of game I used to do with all my students as well, in which I'm asking them to listen 6 stories. Those stories are all invented, means that I just gave them fake name and fake pictures. Those pictures are just selected by Google, so don't search for them. But the stories are real, means that they were inspired by real people that I know. And maybe after listen all of those stories, you recognize uh, some story or some slides that you already heard about it. So let me just go quickly about describing those 6 people. On the top here we have Gino. Gino is a farmer. It's a traditional farmer. He actually produce organic food, and he use what he is considering is a good quality and cleaned way of cultivating. He learned from his father and is continuing doing his job. He did this kind of job for entire his life. Down there, you see this guy in this big container. This is Jack. Jack is a vertical farmer. And as a vertical farmer, he produces vegetables and fruit inside of big containers in different parts of Europe. He's an engineer, so he does have a background in engineering, and he's producing his own stuff, and he's like disseminate and distribute his products through e-commerce. Then we go in the center. On the top there, we have Giacomo. Giacomo is a beekeeper, is a traditional beekeeper. So practically, he learned from his fathers how to produce honey. But in reality, he's an engineer. So he decided to go back to his own village, his own original village. And because he's passionate bees, he decided to use his time to produce honey in a traditional, and he said also organic way. Down there we have Michele, and Michele is actually a digital beekeeper. What does it mean, digital beekeeper? He does have those beekeeping hubs in different places, and he produces honey by using digital devices that monitor the status of the art of his bees and the production of the bees. And through an e-commerce system, he is able to distribute the honey in different parts of Europe. Everything is very traced, so the traceability is very strong, and you can actually know everything about the honey that was produced. And then finally, the last group of people. On the top, we have Marco. Marco is an artisanal, so he's talk about himself like an artist of food, as usually the people in Italy, when they produce traditional food, they call each other. And he learned how to produce Parmesan from his father, and his father from his grandfather. So practically, they transmitted this cultural production generation by generation. He likes how he produce his own Parmesan. He doesn't want actually to change anything in the way how he produce. Down there we have Francesca, and Francesca is a food designer. And as a food designer, she specialized herself to produce by using 3D printer, and she produced food for two specific targets: schools and hospital. So she's able to personalize the production in this way. So 6 stories that are quite familiar maybe to many of you, but now the game is in these questions. Let's actually think that I can give you 10,000 euro, each of you, to invest your money in something for the next 5 years, okay? Or let me be limited for this year, so it will be maybe easier. So you got 10,000 euro, it's a check you can split. Where are you going to invest your money? In the line up or in the line down? It will be great to be there to ask you and to see the ends coming up and down, because we don't have so much time. I'm going to give you usually the answer I receive, and then Mariana maybe can check if it's going to match on what is the situation there. But usually the majority of the people answer that they put their money in the line down, so in the digital line, because they think this is the future, and so they have to invest their money in this. And then the second question I used to ask, which is actually the tricky question, is okay, wonderful. Now I give you 10,000 euro again. I'm very generous, and it's a check, so you cannot split. And I'm asking you to use your money for food that you will eat in this year. So practically where you're going to buy your food, the food that you eat. And maybe you can imagine, but the majority of the people use their money to buy the food that is in the line up, the line, let's say that we call it traditional in a way. And when I'm asking for the reason why, they said, because I don't trust the other line. So definitely we have a paradox here. We have a situation in which it seems that we invest in the future, on what we consider is the future, and we eat what we consider is the present, or better, the past. In reality, this game does give us many takeaways. The first takeaway is the fact that both of those people are working to provide us good quality food and cleaned food. All of them are working to feed the population. As you know, we are so many that we need to be fed, and many, modalities we have, many methodologies we have to get food are all working well for us. And all of them are in a way tries to sustain what abstractly we call sustainability. But there is something we can do to get this in a more concrete way as a view of the food system of nowadays. First of all, the fact that this is not past and is not future, but this is the present. All of them are parallelly working at the same time nowadays. And secondly, what we need to improve is the collaboration between the two lines, because Gino and Jack, so the farmer and the vertical farmer, don't talk each other. They are trained completely different. They don't share their knowledge and their devices and technology as well. And this is so important to do it, because Gino, the policy from the European policy are just asking Gino to produce more organic food for more people. But how Gino can do it? By using traditional models or traditional devices and traditional methodology. He needs the knowledge and the technology of Jack, and Jack needs the knowledge and the competences coming from the past and the real experience of Gino inside of the nature. Let's go on the center, beekeepers. Doesn't matter if you work in digital or undigital way, but the important is to maintain and preserve the bees. The bees are responsible of 70% of the food that we eat. If they will disappear, our food will disappear. So definitely, we doesn't matter what kind of device you use, digital or not, and this is not dangerous. Digital means only monitoring and tailoring the production to be sure that what we have is a good quality and the bees are preserved and conserved well. So definitely doesn't matter what you use, but good to get the preservation of the bees in our hands. And on the other side, parmesan tradition against innovation. This is a big paradox. Tradition and innovation are not two opposites, are two parts of the same line. That means change, and we need to collaborate for maintaining the tradition through using innovative technology. So definitely we need to get them in touch. And when we think about getting in touch, we also think about the fact that maybe new technology devices can help to rethink and remake the systems that nowadays is definitely not sustainable. I'm talking about, for example, the use of waste to produce maybe a packaging, and the 3D printer, for example, can help you to do that. This is an example coming from traditional food, because this is olive oil. And getting a packaging that has an expiration date like your product, that's perfect, because means that the waste will not be any more a waste, but will be a resource. And then when I'm thinking about beekeeper, I'm thinking about those hotels everywhere, hotels for bees. Why they are so important? Yes, they are important for bees, but they are important also for getting awareness. We need to get people informed about the fact that bees are so important and we need to preserve them and the nature around them. And finally, another point that I want to underline is definitely the way how we consider and we think about a farmer. Where we think about farmer, we think about the old man that is in the land working, but farmers are also young people, women, innovators, entrepreneurs, and those people can definitely innovate inside of their system. So what is the main point that we need to underline? That the food system are full of values, and for many times we got the history of problems or the history of solution that we needed, but we forgot to underline the history of the values we have. And many times we are underlining what are the rules that will change the food systems, but we don't actually consider what are the values, the food values that we have to preserve and we have to underline. If it is true that the Sustainable Development Goals and the Agenda 2030 are giving us a kind of drives to follow, to get the food systems more sustainable. And as you know, the food is transversal to all of the other 17 goals. So practically, if we are able to work, as Fabio already anticipated, in a systemic way, we will be able to impact and to get result also on the other goals. It is also true that we don't know enough. This is a survey that was done in Italy 3 years ago, and definitely the new generation are not feeling so responsible for nowadays, and definitely they believe those goals are for the next generation. So it will be a problem for the next generation. And they don't know what is the connection between food and our role on changing the systems. If it's true that we know a lot about the environment, a lot about the green and maybe the Fridays for Future situation help us to underline many issues related to the climate change, we don't actually talk enough about the relation between food and the entire system. So I'm going to end and to underline some of the key points that I hope during the day today you will be able to explore better. What is the role, the metabolic role of the design in the agri-food system? First of all, is the idea of connecting the dots, is the idea of helping the people to recognize that we have problems to solve and we can solve it together. So metabolically, we need to transform those problems in energy. On the other side, we need also to bring people with us in this change, in this transformation. And many conferences, many organizations are working for this kind of advocacy to bring people to understand how design, designer, and systemic thinking used through design thinking and creative thinking can help us to talk different languages, to connect the languages, to be able to see the food system in a systemic way as we introduce it, but also to solve many paradoxes, because we need to be creative co-learner. We need to co-create, which is true, but in the meanwhile, we need also to learn from our co-creation and be also flexible, because many local situations request a lot of research in the field, and many local solutions cannot be just, standardized with big rules or big regulation. We need to find out the way of crossing the borders and emotionally understanding through empathy. And as designer, we know that the empathy is very important, how to pass from an ego-centric approach to the eco-centric approach. This is the only way how we can design regenerative process. That doesn't mean only circularity, doesn't mean only to reuse, but means to produce something that is able, by the learning that they had, to regenerate, to recreate something that it is completely reviewed and in a way considered from the sustainability point of view. This is something that maybe you can go more in depth, and I can give you to Mariana also like a little abstract that you can review about what kind of competencies. Many of those are already mentioned in my speech: the design, the cognitive flexibility, the emotional intelligence, the transdisciplinarity, the creativity, and the circularity. But the main point I want to bring you is that we need to consider and to stop for a second to think about what are the values of food we want to support, what kind of cultural transition, so what kind of mindset change we need, and how we can collaborate with disciplines that are far away from each other to create regenerative ecosystem. It is possible to design a world for sustainable natives. Yes, it is. It's our role, and we need to make it in a digital way. So by using digital and no digital devices methodology. Thanks. I hope I was in time because I didn't check it. So I'm sorry if I was
You
not.
were super in time, Sonia. So thank you very much, both of you. They were super nice speeches. So now the idea is that maybe students are like getting into the food systems, and maybe you have some questions for them. So now is the moment. I think that it was very clear that food system is like a very large scale. And many times we think about things that are happening like very far away from where we are, and we do not realize how this impacts in our everyday life. So did you ever think about this like you were watching today? Did you?
When I started reading about food systems and I introduced myself in this topic in food design, I realized that sometimes most of your behaviors, in your daily behaviors and habits, can change radically the way you live and the way you have your perspective about food. And maybe it's more about being conscious and aware of what is around you and what you can do as an individual, and maybe can make this step
Good. And I have one
Well,
question for.
we,
Yeah,
we,
go,
we can
go.
actually connect it, because I think one of the key points that Fabio also underlined, and is the fact that it's not enough you. It's actually a system approach also in the intervention we have to do it. The designer can be just a kind of director of the orchestra of the change, because we help people to change mindset and maybe to redesign and to rethink the systems. But it's also kind of too much easy way to consider that if we change tomorrow the way how we eat, definitely everything will change. We need to get this kind of intervention on many levels and layers at the same time. And it is important, it's true that the consumer are important, but it's also true that the system must be reviewed from the beginning of the chain, not only at the end. And I don't know if Fabio wants to underline this again.
Yeah, just building on what Sonia was saying, we always need to think about governance, meaning how is the food system organized, who holds power, and what are the consequences of this distribution of power, even on our individual choices. I mean, after all, we can decide to eat this or eat that, but our choices are limited to what we can find. And so the question is, why is that we found these things and not those? Why are our choices limited to this? So I think making good choices, personal good choices, is very important, but at the same time, we cannot forget that large structural systems cannot be solved just by individual initiatives, that there needs to be something bigger. And I think that's where, the role of designers, understanding that everything that happens is systemic. I think that's a big mind change that is quite important for designers to become really effective in the food system.
Yeah, so I was going to ask about the governments, because nowadays there's this message that is telling us that we can all do things together, and that's absolutely true. But Fabio, you wrote a book about how politics are intervening into this. So I think that this comment is very important to introduce us in the needing of this collaboration in between the government and the people and everything that it's there in the middle, right?
How Sonia was mentioning how important are the values. The values, it's also what's at the bottom of politics. My idea of a good future is different from the idea of the good future that, I don't know, a stockholder in a large agribusiness has. My idea of the good future is different from a Mexican farmer that it's part of the international movement La Via Campesina. So values, because the food system is a wicked problem, there are so many stakeholders with different agendas, priorities, needs. Values are central because those become at the core of every political discussions. And by politics, I mean decided what the future of the community will be, what the future of the community will look like. That depends on the values we embrace. And so, the political negotiations become very important because, I feel that my values are the most important, but probably also the other person feels that their values are the most important. So, that's where politics come in.
And if I can, I would like to add that there is also an innovative role for designer in this, because we need to underline the opportunities that are many times in some local system and must be recognized and viewed by the standard system. So just to be concrete, there were many ways of working systematically in the food field in the past that nowadays the rules and the policies are not accepting, okay, because of the many regulation that provide us good quality food and of course hygienic or many other issues that are important nowadays for the people to get also cleaned food and traced food. But then there were relation, interaction, something that locally or in a small scale farm, for example, were working well. And they were based on values because collaborating in a territory, in a community for producing something was very strong maybe in the past. And nowadays you cannot do it anymore. So how and what is the role of the designer? To find a way to restore and to help those interaction and those relation not to be forgot or to be in a way supported by different methods or different ways. Why I don't have the word in my mind, because the design doesn't come as an invention. Design, as you know, it comes from a research. You have to search, you have to stay with people, you have to be in the field, you have to understand not their problems, you have to understand what kind of opportunities are behind their problems, because definitely they recognize some cultural values that you can exalt. And that's not the easy part, because many times those values are also hidden behind commercial values that are not the same. So it's definitely a research approach, and that's my also suggestion for you. Don't be superficial when you do your research. Don't search on Google good practice and say, okay, I know exactly what I have to do now. I have to do a market that does this. No, go to talk with people. Go in the field. You cannot work in food without touching food and without being close to the people who produce, distribute, commercialize, and eat food. Because that's the only way how you can create something that concretely impact on the life of people. Otherwise, I've seen many projects coming out very creative, very virtuous, let me use this word, but not completely disconnected, sorry, with the real life. And that's exactly what we don't need nowadays for the problems and the use of the resources that we have. We are wasting so much resources we cannot waste anymore. Okay.
Great. Thank you very much for also your last comments. Do you have any other question, guys? Great. Okay. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for your words, for your speech, for your talk, for your knowledge and sharing it with us. And we will be in touch. So thank you very much again.
Have a good rest of the day. Bye-bye.
Bye. I will stop recording.
Good luck and enjoy. Ciao.
Ciao.